They took my seat. I took their company.
I'm James, 34, and until last Friday, I was technically employed at Harrison Technologies, a manufacturing company my late father-in-law Richard started 40 years ago. I say technically because nobody really took my job seriously. To the board of directors, I was just another trust fund kid who married the boss's daughter. They called me the son-in-law with no real job, usually whispered by board members who couldn't balance their own checkbooks without calling their accountants. They had no idea what was coming. Let me back up. I met Sarah, Richard's daughter, 7 years ago. Her dad was this brilliant businessman who actually understood what a balance sheet was, unlike most of his board. Richard wasn't just my father-in-law. He became my mentor and chess partner. We'd spend years in his study laughing at the board's incompetence over expensive scotch, secretly planning for the day when the company would need saving from the very people running it. While everyone saw me as useless, Richard saw something different. He taught me everything about the real business, not the sanitized MBA version. The late-night meetings with factory managers, the unglamorous work of understanding how things actually functioned, the importance of knowing every employee's name instead of just the ones who could advance your career. He recognized early on that I gave a damn about the company itself, not just the stock price. 3 years ago, Sarah and I got married, and I joined the company in some vague analyst role that nobody took seriously. The board treated me like furniture. I'd overheard that exact phrase at least a dozen times. To them, I was the guy who married into money and somehow hadn't transformed into some ruthless corporate titan. Perfect. Let them underestimate me. Richard got diagnosed with terminal cancer 6 months ago. 3 weeks before he died, he pulled me into his study, poured us both 3 fingers of his favorite whiskey, and slid a folder across the desk. He told me casually that doctors gave him a month, maybe 2, and he'd be damned if he let those parasites tear apart everything he built. Inside that folder were share transfer documents giving me 71% controlling interest in Harrison Technologies. Richard had set up the perfect checkmate, and he wouldn't even be alive to see it play out. He made me promise to keep it secret, especially from Sarah. He loved his daughter, but knew she didn't understand what it took to actually run a company. She understood optics and branding and image. She thought business was a photo shoot. I'd seen her Pinterest board for her CEO aesthetic before Richard was even buried. We had everything notarized and witnessed by both our attorneys, plus a notary public named Gladys, who ran a small office in the suburbs and had no idea she was witnessing a corporate nuclear bomb being armed. Richard even completed an expert-level Sudoku puzzle that day in under 8 minutes, just to have extra evidence of his mental competence. The man thought of everything. Richard's funeral 3 weeks ago was a corporate-sponsored production. The whole scene felt like Greek tragedy with dramatic organ music and performative sniffling. Sarah stood up front in her designer black dress that looked more red carpet than funeral attire, and the board members watched her like hyenas eyeing fresh meat. I could practically see dollar signs spinning in their eyes. David Sterling, the silver-haired chairman who looked like he'd been born wearing a 3-piece suit, kept adjusting his tie and exchanging meaningful glances with other vultures. Kevin Parker, whose personality could best be described as wet cardboard left in a drizzle, was practically salivating. He was probably already mentally redecorating Richard's corner office. Behind me, someone whispered that I didn't even have a real position, just showed up sometimes and played on my computer. The thing was, they weren't entirely wrong. I didn't have a flashy title or corner office or business cards I handed out at networking events. What I did have was Richard's trust, a legitimate business degree from Northwestern that I'd actually earned, and an ability to see through corporate nonsense that would make a professional poker player jealous. After the funeral, Sarah threw herself a coronation party. An appointment celebration. The penthouse ballroom had been transformed into what I can only describe as nouveau riche meets desperate for approval. Ice sculptures shaped like the company logo were already melting under hot lights, creating little puddles of corporate symbolism on marble floors. There was an actual champagne fountain like we were at a 1995 wedding, and a string quartet that nobody listened to because everyone was too busy networking. The board members who couldn't name a single factory employee were suddenly gathered around Sarah, toasting new eras and bold leadership and other meaningless phrases that sounded impressive, but were essentially verbal wallpaper. David was holding court near the bar, explaining to anyone who'd listen how he'd always known Sarah had the vision to lead. This was the same guy who'd told Richard 6 months earlier that women were too emotional for executive positions. But apparently, end and dollar signs changed perspectives. Kevin found me by one of the melting ice sculptures. He was holding a martini and wearing the kind of smile that made you check if your wallet was still in your pocket. He got way too close, his gin breath competing with his cologne in an olfactory attack, and said something about how it was hell of a night. Then he patted my back with patronizing sympathy, usually reserved for dogs who failed obedience school. He made some joke about my tough luck going from CEO's son-in-law to whatever it was I did there, laughing at his own mean-spirited observation disguised as humor. I could see other board members nearby pretending not to eavesdrop. I smiled and told him I was breathing and collecting dividends, which was honestly exhausting. Sometimes I had to sit down. He laughed harder, not realizing he'd just congratulated his actual boss. Behind him, David was watching our interaction with hawk-like intensity, probably trying to gauge whether I'd cause problems or fade quietly into wallpaper like a good trust fund baby. The thing about being underestimated is that it's like having a superpower nobody knows about. While Kevin was busy mentally composing stories about poor James and his little analyst job, I was calculating exactly how long it would take to dismantle his entire career. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if I wanted to be thorough. Friday morning arrived like a freight train nobody ordered. I got an email from David's assistant at exactly 9:30 a.m. requesting my presence in conference room A. The email read with all the warmth of a restraining order. Conference room A was the big one, the intimidation chamber with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, and a table so long you could land aircraft on it. It was where they held really important meetings, the ones that decided whether entire departments got axed. 6 board members were already seated around that massive table when I walked in. David sat at the head naturally because he'd probably sleep in that chair if his wife let him. Kevin was to his right, wearing a smile that suggested he'd been practicing in the mirror. Gerald Foster was half asleep as usual, which probably made him the smartest person in the room. There were 3 others whose names I honestly couldn't remember, middle management types promoted beyond their competence. David cleared his throat dramatically, like he'd rehearsed this moment multiple times while trying different ties to see which made him look most authoritative. He said my name like he was addressing a disappointing houseplant, then launched into a prepared statement about reviewing organizational structure and making adjustments to align resources with strategic objectives. Corporate speak in its finest form, beautiful, meaningless buzzwords strung together. Kevin couldn't contain himself and leaned forward like a kid who couldn't wait to tell you your dog died. He announced they were terminating my position effective immediately. The room went quiet except for one guy frantically typing on his iPad. Patricia Chen, the CFO who actually knew her job, was staring at her hands like they contained secrets of the universe. I let the moment hang there while they waited for my reaction. They wanted begging, panic, maybe tears. The whole firing ritual depended on the sufferer playing their role correctly. Instead, I smiled and told them this was perfect. I'd been worried they'd make it awkward. I appreciated the efficiency and thanked them for not making me sit through an emotional HR exit interview. Their smiles flickered like faulty light bulbs. This wasn't the script. David's forehead creased in a way that suggested his Botox was working overtime. I stood up, straightened my tie, and gathered my things casually like I was leaving a coffee shop, not a career. I picked up the fancy pen they'd given me 3 years ago, now just an overpriced writing instrument. I told them it was just business, nothing personal. Companies evolve, people move on, circle of corporate life, and all that. As I walked toward the door, I could feel confusion radiating off them like heat waves off July asphalt. At the door, I turned back and gave them my best genuine smile. I told them it had been educational, that I'd learned so much about corporate governance, strategic planning, and the creative limits of expense account fraud. Patricia actually choked on air at that one. That weekend was glorious. I opened the safe, hidden behind an abstract painting in my home office that Sarah thought was just really boring art. She'd bought it at a charity auction because the artist was emerging and provocative, which meant he'd figured out how to charge $5,000 for what looked like a toddler's finger painting. Behind it was a biometric safe Richard had helped me install one weekend while Sarah was in Milan, doing whatever wealthy women do there. Inside lay the document that was about to turn Harrison Technologies completely upside down. The notarized transfer of 71% controlling shares, signed by Richard 3 weeks before he died, witnessed by his personal attorney, my lawyer Jennifer Chen, and Gladys the notary, who had no idea what she was witnessing. The paper was heavy, expensive quality that screamed important legal document just by existing. I texted Jennifer a photo with a simple message asking how our position looked after they'd fired me. Her response came in under 30 seconds. She'd had 3 separate firms review it. The transfer was legally binding and ironclad. She told me to sit tight and let them dig their own graves, then congratulated me on the termination with its hilarious timing. I did exactly what Jennifer suggested. I sat tight and watched from the sidelines as the board popped champagne, reshuffled management positions like musical chairs at a cutthroat birthday party, and spread rumors that I was emotionally unstable. The rumors started circulating by Monday afternoon. I heard about them from Dave, the security guard in the lobby who'd always been friendly because I actually learned his name and asked about his kids. He told me people upstairs were saying I'd had a breakdown, which he called nonsense because I was the most normal person in the building. By Wednesday, the rumor mill had evolved to creative fiction. According to breakroom gossip I was still getting from friendly faces in accounting, I'd apparently had a screaming match with Sarah, thrown a laptop at Kevin, been caught day drinking in my office, and was possibly joining a competitor. My personal favorite was the rumor about an affair with someone from HR, which was both completely false and weirdly specific. Sarah called exactly once during all this, on Thursday evening. She said people were talking and I was making her look bad. I almost laughed, like I'd fired myself just to be inconvenient. I told her I got fired from a job that barely existed, and if that made her look bad, maybe the problem wasn't me. She hung up without saying goodbye. Meanwhile, Jennifer kept me updated throughout the weekend with texts ranging from informative to hilarious. Saturday afternoon, she sent board meeting minutes that had leaked to her. They were already planning to sell 2 subsidiaries, calling it strategic divestment to maximize shareholder value. Both were actually profitable with real growth potential. They were selling the good stuff to juice quarterly numbers before inevitably jumping ship. It was so predictable, it hurt. The board was doing exactly what short-sighted executives always did, sacrificing long-term stability for short-term gains that would make their stock options look good. Richard had seen it coming, which is exactly why he'd made his move. Sunday afternoon, I was reading financial reports Jennifer sent over, 3 reports deep into their idiocy, making notes in margins like I was grading term papers from students who hadn't studied. They were planning to sell Anderson Manufacturing to a private equity firm for substantially less than it was worth, probably because someone on the board had a connection and expected a kickback. The tech startup, a company called Neural Sync developing genuinely interesting AI applications for manufacturing automation, was being shopped to competitors. It was like watching someone sell a classic car for scrap metal prices, because they couldn't be bothered to understand what they had. Sunday night, my phone rang. Kevin Parker. I stared at his name for 10 seconds, debating whether answering would be worth the entertainment value. Curiosity won. He had that forced cheerfulness of someone who was either drunk or about to ask for something, possibly both. He asked how my weekend was, how I was processing everything after the termination. I told him I was processing my emotions and contemplating life choices. Also made waffles. They were excellent. There was a pause, like he was trying to figure out if I was being sarcastic. I was always being sarcastic. He said he was calling friend to friend, totally off the record, because he knew a guy at a small firm downtown who was always looking for talented people. He could put in a good word, help me land on my feet. The condescension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Kevin was offering me an entry-level analyst position, like he was doing me some enormous favor, like throwing a life preserver to a drowning man. I asked if the firm needed someone to buy them out by Monday, because I had some capital freed up and was always interested in investment opportunities. Complete beautiful silence. I could practically hear gears grinding in Kevin's head. He finally managed to say he meant like an analyst position, entry-level stuff to get me back in the game. I told him I understood perfectly. I just thought if we're talking downtown firms, we might as well think big. But if they needed an analyst, tell them to send me the info. Kevin didn't get the joke. He never got jokes unless they were explained in PowerPoint format with supporting documentation. Monday morning, I put on my best Navy suit, the one Sarah once said made me look like a well-paid accountant. I'd taken it as an insult at the time, but now realized it was perfect. Accountants were underestimated and overlooked, the kind of people who quietly kept track of where all the bodies were buried. I paired it with a crisp white shirt, a burgundy tie Richard had given me 2 Christmases ago, and cufflinks that had belonged to his father. The Harrison building looked the same on Monday morning, glass and steel reaching into the Chicago sky with the company logo emblazoned on the side in letters visible from space. Security stopped me before I even made it to elevators. Dave wasn't there. Instead, it was Marcus, who looked like he'd played linebacker in college and took his intimidation job very seriously. Janet from HR had to escort me upstairs. The same Janet who'd processed my termination paperwork Friday with the emotional investment of someone filing a TPS report. We rode up in silence, her clutching her tablet like a shield, me humming the theme from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, because if you're having a showdown, you need the right soundtrack. She finally said this was highly irregular. I told her I appreciated that, I knew it wasn't in her job description, and I'd always found her professional. She asked if I was about to do something crazy. I asked her to define crazy because from where I stood, what was crazy was a board selling off profitable subsidiaries to pad their portfolios. I was just there to have a conversation. I walked into the boardroom and every single face froze in that special way faces do when someone they definitely weren't expecting shows up. Kevin nearly choked on his coffee, sputtering like an old lawnmower trying to start. David's expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and the beginning stages of understanding that something had gone very wrong with his Monday morning plans. I greeted them cheerfully, set my briefcase down with a solid thunk, apologized to Patricia for being gender exclusive, and commented on the beautiful morning. I'd actually seen a cardinal on my way in. They say that's good luck. David squinted at me like a mirage that might disappear if he blinked hard enough. He said slowly that I didn't work there anymore. I agreed completely. Very true. They'd fired me Friday. I remembered clearly, quite the production, very dramatic. Although Gerald falling asleep halfway through kind of undercut the gravitas. Gerald jerked awake at his name, asking what happened. I continued, ignoring his protests. While I didn't work there anymore, I owned there, and that made meetings complicated. I dropped the folder on the table, right in the center where everyone could see it. The sound of paper hitting polished wood seemed louder than it should have been. The folder was clearly labeled Transfer of Controlling Interest, Harrison Technologies, Inc. Kevin reached for it first, his hand shaking slightly. I watched his face go through initial confidence, growing concern, dawning horror, and complete devastation. He whispered that this couldn't be real, but his voice cracked in a way that suggested he knew it absolutely was. He started saying I expected them to believe that Richard would hand over controlling interest to me, to someone who didn't even have a real job, someone who couldn't even hold down a basic analyst position. His voice climbed in pitch with each word until he sounded like he was auditioning for high school theater. I held up one finger. First, they fired me, so the whole couldn't hold down narrative was revisionist. Second, believe whatever helps them sleep at night. I didn't need faith. I had documents, mountains of them. Notarized, witnessed, reviewed by multiple legal teams and filed with the SEC. Legal documents don't care about feelings. David finally found his voice, strangled. He said this could destabilize the entire company, their shareholders, their investors, market confidence. I interrupted. They already did that. They'd been doing it for years. I was there to fix it. Think of me as a very polite hurricane. Patricia actually snorted at that, quickly covering it with a cough when David shot her a death glare. My phone buzzed loudly on the table. I glanced at the screen and felt my grin widen. Anderson Holdings, our largest external investor. Perfect timing. I answered deliberately, putting it on speaker, setting the phone in the middle of the table where everyone could hear. Victoria Martinez from Anderson Holdings said she was calling regarding news about Harrison Technologies' ownership structure. They needed to schedule a meeting today if possible. I could see David's face losing color, draining from angry red to pale gray. Anderson Holdings owned 18% of remaining shares, not controlling interest, but enough to matter, enough to make or break any major decision. I told Victoria I was actually in a board meeting discussing the transition. How did 2 o'clock work? My offices, she said. Bring your attorney and CFO. They had a lot to discuss regarding the current board's recent decisions. I said absolutely, I'd have Jennifer Chen with me as attorney, and I'd bring Patricia Chen as well, assuming she was willing to step into the CFO role officially. I glanced at Patricia, who looked like she'd won the lottery and been drafted simultaneously. Victoria said she looked forward to working with leadership that actually understood fiduciary responsibility. The line went dead, but that last comment hung in the air like a grenade with its pin pulled. The silence was deafening. Kevin looked like someone had told him Santa wasn't real, and his childhood dog had been sent to a farm where they turned dogs into hot dogs. His worldview was crumbling in real time. Kevin whispered this was insane. But there was no fight left. It was the sound of a man realizing the game was over, and he'd lost spectacularly. Gerald suddenly announced from his corner that he was retiring. His wife wanted to travel, see Italy, maybe learn to paint. This seemed like a good time. David started protesting, but Gerald interrupted, standing with more energy than I'd seen in 3 years. He was 72, had more money than he could spend, didn't need this stress. He told me Victoria Martinez didn't suffer fools, so clean house before that meeting. He nodded respectfully and walked out. I told everyone to take a breath and reconvene. I had a meeting at 2, giving us 4 hours to figure out how to explain to Victoria why they were trying to sell Anderson Manufacturing, named after her grandfather, to a private equity firm for 30% below market value. I asked Patricia to pull together all financial data on that proposed sale. I wanted every number. She nodded, already pulling out her laptop. She said she'd have it within the hour, and for what it's worth, she voted against that sale. It was in the minutes. I told her I knew because I'd read them. That's why she still had a job. Kevin finally found his voice again, weak and defeated. Was I really going to do this, just take over? I paused at the door. I already did. At 2 o'clock sharp, I walked into Victoria Martinez's offices on the 47th floor, flanked by Jennifer Chen and Patricia. Victoria's office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who made her first billion by 35. Floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture that was simultaneously obscenely expensive, and 0 personal touches except one black and white photograph of an older man I assumed was her grandfather. Victoria was standing by the window when we entered, silhouetted against the Chicago skyline. She turned and extended her hand with a grip that was firm without being aggressive, the handshake of someone who'd perfected professional intimidation. We settled into leather chairs around a glass conference table. She got straight to the point. Anderson Holdings didn't support chaos. They had 18% of Harrison Technologies, making them our largest external investor. When Richard was alive, they had confidence. When Sarah took over, they had concerns. Now, I was telling her I'd been majority shareholder this entire time, and she needed to understand what that meant for their investment. I matched her directness. I only caused chaos when necessary, and right now it was very necessary. The board had been running Harrison like a personal ATM for years, about to sell her grandfather's company to a private equity vulture for pennies on the dollar. I pulled out Patricia's folder. Cost freezes on all executive compensation until we stabilized. Full audit of every department to identify where we were hemorrhaging money and talent. Leadership cleanup, anyone who couldn't justify their position got voted out. And investor transparency with monthly reports on everything, not sanitized nonsense. Victoria read through it with the speed and focus of someone who actually understood what she was looking at. Minutes passed in silence. My phone buzzed. Jennifer's personal cell she only used for emergencies or good gossip. The message said they were trying to claim Richard was mentally unfit when he signed. David hired a hotshot firm to challenge the share transfer, filing in court tomorrow morning. I almost laughed. Of course they were. I texted back telling Jennifer to send them Richard's medical clearance from 3 weeks before he signed and include a Sudoku puzzle. Tell them Richard completed it the same day in under 8 minutes, expert level. For irony, Jennifer responded that I was her favorite client and she'd bill them for the puzzle. Victoria looked up, catching my smile. Good news? The opposite, actually. The board was trying to challenge the transfer by claiming Richard wasn't mentally competent filing tomorrow. Instead of concern, Victoria smiled, something almost predatory. If my shares stood, they'd back me fully. 18% voting with my 71%. If they managed to overturn it, they were pulling their entire investment within 90 days and shorting our stock on the way out. She wanted competent leadership and didn't care who provided it, but wouldn't watch her grandfather's legacy get pillaged by idiots. We talked strategy for another hour. Specific cuts, potential hires, timeline for the audit, communication plans. Victoria was sharp, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of issues and pointing out problems I hadn't considered. By the time we wrapped, I had a headache, 17 pages of notes, and grudging respect for someone who could make me feel simultaneously incompetent and motivated. Tuesday morning arrived crisp and clear, ironic considering I was spending it in courthouse watching desperate men try to rewrite history. Circuit Court of Cook County wasn't anyone's idea of fun. All institutional beige walls, uncomfortable benches, and the faint smell of stress and defeated dreams. David was there with Richard Thornton, who looked exactly like an expensive lawyer should. Silver temples, 3-piece suit probably costing more than most monthly rents, and an air of superiority suggesting he thought Judge Judy was lowbrow entertainment. Kevin was there looking like he hadn't slept. Patricia had positioned herself on our side of the aisle, already having made her choice. Judge Patricia Morrison entered, maybe 60. Gray hair and a no-nonsense bun. Reading glasses she looked over rather than through, giving her perpetual expression of being deeply unimpressed with everyone's nonsense. I liked her immediately. Richard Thornton stood with theatrical flourish that suggested he'd practiced this movement in front of mirrors. He claimed a grave injustice had occurred. Richard had been manipulated in his final days by me into signing away controlling interest while undergoing intensive chemotherapy on significant pain medication, not in condition to make sound business decisions. Jennifer didn't wait to be called before standing. Judge Morrison told her to please save some time. Jennifer said everything Thornton just said was demonstrably false and frankly insulting to Richard's memory. She had medical clearance from his oncologist dated the same day as signing, confirming he was of sound mind and not under influence of any impairing medications. She had testimony from notary Gladys Henderson, who spoke with Richard at length and found him completely lucid. She had testimony from his personal attorney, confirming Richard understood exactly what he was doing. Then she paused for dramatic effect, pulling out paper with flourish matching Thornton's theatrics. They had a completed expert-level Sudoku puzzle Richard finished the same day in under 8 minutes with perfect accuracy. I had to bite my cheek to keep from laughing at the expressions. Thornton looked like his law degree was being recalled. David went through 7 shades of red. Kevin just stared at the puzzle like it was ancient Sumerian. Judge Morrison repeated slowly, "A Sudoku puzzle?" Jennifer confirmed she was submitting it as a supplementary evidence along with medical documentation, legal testimony, and notarized statements. But yes, a man completing expert Sudoku in under 8 minutes was clearly capable of understanding a share transfer. If Thornton wanted to attempt the same puzzle under similar conditions to prove it wasn't indicative of mental acuity, she was happy to provide one. Several people in the gallery actually laughed, including the court reporter who tried covering it with a cough. Judge Morrison's lips twitched, fighting a smile. Thornton adjusted his glasses, trying to recover, claiming the timing was suspicious. Richard dies, and suddenly his son-in-law, who held no significant position, owns 71%, Jennifer countered smoothly. The timing was suspicious because Richard knew he was dying and wanted to protect his company from exactly what was happening now. He watched his board run Harrison like a personal piggy bank for years, prioritize short-term gains over long-term stability. He made a calculated decision to transfer controlling interest to someone he trusted, someone who actually understood the business, someone who wasn't going to sell off profitable divisions to pad quarterly reports. That wasn't manipulation, it was good business sense and foresight. Judge Morrison held up her hand, silencing both attorneys. She'd reviewed documentation submitted by both parties. The medical evidence was compelling, the legal documentation was in order, and frankly, the Sudoku puzzle was more convincing than most expert testimony she'd seen. The share transfer was completely valid and legally binding. Court dismissed. By 11 Tuesday morning, I reconvened the board in the same conference room where they'd fired me 4 days earlier. Except this time I sat at the head of the table in Richard's old seat. Everyone filed in looking like they were attending their own funeral. Patricia looked relieved. Gerald was conspicuously absent, having already submitted retirement paperwork via email with subject line, "I'm out." I started with Kevin, keeping my voice friendly. His resignation was effective immediately. "Don't forget your mug." I gestured to the world's best executive mug he'd bought himself because apparently nobody else would give him that award. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it, closed it. The man looked like a fish, realizing it was no longer in water. Finally, he stood, grabbed his mug, and walked out with whatever dignity he could scrape together. Silence filled the room, sweet, golden, beautiful silence. I pulled out Patricia's folder and got to work. Anderson Manufacturing sale canceled effective immediately. Patricia would draft the letter to the PE firm, professional but clear. We weren't interested now or ever. Neural Sync sale also canceled. That company was actually innovative, unlike some people in this room. Full operational audit of every department with Patricia leading, having my full authority to fire anyone who couldn't justify their position or budget. All executive bonuses frozen until we stabilized operations and employee retention. I knew that would be tough, but surely they'd survive on 6-figure base salaries. Try cutting back on golf club memberships if money got tight. By afternoon, the press had picked up the story, spreading through financial news like wildfire. Bloomberg ran, "Fired executive revealed as 71% owner of Harrison Technologies." Wall Street Journal went with "Corporate coup, how Richard Harrison's son-in-law took control from beyond the grave." CNBC brought me on for a remote interview where the anchor asked point blank how I responded to critics saying this was manipulation of a dying man. I replied my critics should read medical documentation and court ruling before making accusations they couldn't back up. Richard was one of the smartest businessmen I'd ever known who made a calculated decision to protect the company he built. If people wanted to call that manipulation, they were welcome to their opinion, but the law disagreed. And about firing board members on my first day, technically my fifth day, but who's counting? Kevin was trying to sell profitable divisions for personal gain. That wasn't management, that was looting. I wasn't there to play nice with people treating Harrison like an ATM. The interview went viral. By 5 o'clock, I had 3 voicemails from other outlets, 2 podcast interview requests, and 1 interesting offer from 60 Minutes wanting to do a segment on corporate succession in family businesses. Sarah called at 6:30, right as I was packing to head home. She screamed before I even got the phone to my ear about how I'd humiliated her. Everyone was talking about how she fired her husband, who actually owned the company. Did I know what people were saying? What this did to her reputation? I let her rant for 45 seconds before calmly explaining that I heard every word. She was upset because she fired her husband without knowing he owned 71% of her family's company. She was embarrassed because it made her look impulsive and uninformed, which, to be fair, was accurate. But she humiliated herself. She wanted to be CEO so badly she didn't bother asking questions or doing basic due diligence. She wanted the title and the Instagram aesthetic without understanding what running a company actually required. I told her to call me when she was ready to have an actual conversation instead of a tantrum. Then I hung up. That evening, I stood in Richard's office, now my office, with a glass of the expensive whiskey he'd given me for my 30th birthday, with a note saying to save it for when I really needed it. The desk was clean, chairs positioned perfectly, the view of Chicago at night exactly as spectacular as I remembered from all those late nights we'd spent planning this exact scenario. I looked out at the city lights, stretching toward the horizon like a field of electric stars. Somewhere out there, David was probably rage-calling his lawyers. Kevin was updating his LinkedIn. Sarah was planning her comeback narrative for social media. And I was here holding Richard's life's work, ready to actually run it properly. This wasn't just revenge, though watching Kevin's face when I fired him was incredibly satisfying. This was restoration. Richard had built Harrison Technologies from nothing, turned it into something that mattered, something employing thousands of people and creating value beyond just shareholder profits. The board had been slowly cannibalizing it, and he'd trusted me to stop them. I raised my glass to the city skyline, to the empty office, to Richard's memory, to whatever came next. The real work was just beginning. We had audits to conduct, departments to restructure, employees to protect, and a company to actually run properly instead of bleeding dry. But tonight, I let myself enjoy this moment. The quiet satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly, of trust honored, of a legacy protected. To new beginnings, I whispered, may they always be this interesting.